Hey everyone, this week we start talking about political communication, but I think one of the elements within political communication is this idea of what makes stories newsworthy. We'll talk about newsworthiness and then also this notion of persuasion. We usually talk about persuasion on a one to one or interpersonal basis, but I think it's interesting to think about it from a media effects perspective. Schmidt and Cohen are talking about this idea of censorship, and at the very basic level, we talk about filtering as the euphemism that describes it. We know that certain countries outside of the Western realm, such as China, a country that has over 1 billion people, has websites that we use on a almost minute by minute basis now, such as Facebook and Twitter and Tumblr, all censored and banned. And we know that there are countries that are moving toward this ultimate censorship, complete censorship, to censorship that is more so controlled, such as Turkey. In 2011, Turkey imposed a government-wide, nationwide online filtering system that had 4 tiers of censorship, such as child, standard, and family, in order to help the privileges of the individuals using the internet. At the same time, as much as we like to talk about censorship from a pro-social benefit, such as, well, we get to stop the distribution of child pornography, I don't think you would find many people that are opposed to that idea. We would love to completely eliminate that. But unfortunately, like most government controlled entities, we talk about some of the potential sort of downsides of using this online filtering system, such as Schmidt and Cohen talk about this idea of the Sunni web, using countries such as Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Algeria, so on and so forth, that could theoretically come together with an alliance, build this online filtering system, but unfortunately, based on their political agendas and also the religion that's tied to them, the censorship would restrict websites that involve gay and lesbian content. Also, ethnic and religious minority groups may be very closely monitored or even restricted, or in the worst case scenario, blocked from even using the internet. So we know that online filtering has its upsides if used properly, but we also know that it can be used as an oppressive tool. Just like in North Korea, they have the Kurio link, which makes it so that users cannot receive or make international calls. And they also don't have access to the internet, which is mind-blowing for us. But again, a very different type of atmosphere, very different culture. They have an intranet, which the government then mandates and controls information that is present. And when we think about news and the way that we consume media, Westerman, Bowman, and Lachlan talk about different agendas and beliefs that are promoted based on the proximity that a user has to the news story. Obviously, when we get into situations such as the Boston bombing with the marathon, I'm in Chicago. I'm, I guess, geographically close enough to Boston, but we know that people around the world, let alone in the Boston area, the proximity didn't matter because of the prominence of that story. We know that in most cases, storylines function on this inverted pyramid style of news reporting: the who, what, when, where, how, and then you slowly build up from that basic level downward, other information, background info that's useful. But more often than not, when we're talking about the consumption of media, we talk about salience, this idea that we place a specific amount of importance or prominence on each issue. Now, as a result of that, what happens is that the prominence that we place on it might not also be the prominence that the news cycle plays on it either. So we look at salience being bolstered and increased through a lot of different tactics and varieties, one of which is that newspapers will put the headline on the front page, or they'll spend a couple of days doing an expose devoted to a particular issue. So me as a viewer, as I'm sitting there and every time I pick up the Washington Post, I see the same story after the same story, and then I open it the next day and right back on the front page. Okay, so the reoccurrence of this information really makes it so that the entity that's producing this content is promoting a certain agenda. But what happens with the advent of social media where we actually get to pick and choose the information that we gain from? For instance, not everyone is using traditional means like CNN.com or MSNBC to gather information. Instead, we talk about this notion of a marketplace of ideas where we can actually choose, like a market, we can pick, oh, we want to hear this information from this person, or I like this political pundit's ideas, or oh, this is my friend who's really insightful. we get to essentially control the way that we consume media. The example that's used to help illustrate this is the NFL lockout. What happened is that the news reporters were trying to make commentary about the players, but the players, because of Twitter and Instagram, were able to actually make a case for themselves. And we know that because of that, it causes some sort of dissonance when we're consuming media. We're taught from a very early age that it is important for us to look at these credible sources and make sense of it. But what happens when we have new individuals who are able to give us insight that otherwise we wouldn't have access to? In a way, we talk about the elaboration likelihood model, or ELM if you want. It argues that when we're being persuaded of information, such as a news source, we look at it through the factual evidence and the argument, so that's sort of the central route of persuasion. And then everything else surrounding it is the peripheral route of persuasion. And so when we're talking about receiving information, the first step that we do is we look at the central route. Do all these arguments, these factoids, make sense to me? And if so, if I can get past that central route, I start to look at other information. Who is the center of the source? What other contextual clues do I need? And it ties right into this notion of theory of reasoned action, that there's a specific sequence of events that happens when we are trying to make sense, right? Reasoned action. We're trying to enact an action. We want to be reasonably informed. The first step, naturally, when we receive a message, is that the message will inherently impact our attitudes or subjective norms. So we receive information, we take a step back, and it might even happen in that moment, and we go, okay, does this impact my attitudes or beliefs? And then second, we think about how our behavior intentions might move. So before the acquisition of this knowledge, what was my intended behavior? And finally, is there a behavioral change? And this behavioral change is what we look at to be the most important and most prominent part of theory of reasoned action. Now, if we take it a step further, we talk about the theory of planned behavior, which is basically the same element, but it adds in this concept of self-efficacy, or the belief that I can reasonably accomplish or achieve some sort of behavior. Okay, so tying all these pieces together, we have to take in information that impacts our attitudes or beliefs, our subjective norms. Then what we do is we see if our behavior intentions are swaying one way or another, and then ultimately, does our behavior change? And again, the theory of planned behavior tacks on this idea of self-efficacy. Do I genuinely believe that my actions and behaviors are impacted by this, and can I make a difference? I just want you to think back to the way that you receive information. From a very early age, we start to pick up on the different nuances, the behaviors that our parents or family members go about doing, right? So our dad stubs his toe, he says, "Oh, crap," slams his fist on the table. 20 years later, we haven't stubbed our toe, we slam our fist on the table. Okay, social learning theory is essentially this idea that we start to model behaviors based on what we've learned. There's a social element, and then there's a learning component. We know that there are four major types of ideas that align with this social learning theory. We know that different individuals have to first attend, so they have to devote kind of resources to the behavior itself that's being modeled, so I'm paying attention to it. Then I have to, second, retain that information, so I have to figure out, okay, what was the main premise of what's going on? Then I have to have, and this is arguably the most important part, I have to have, number three, motivation. I have to be motivated internally or externally to reproduce the behavior that I first attended and then retained. If I'm not motivated to use this behavior in some way, then I cannot, fourth point, reproduce that behavior, either cognitively or physically reproduce the behavior that's being modeled. Ultimately, we look at the way that people take in information from a news source. We hear all these articles, which Ohio State University would vehemently disagree with, that video games make children violent. And if we take on this idea of social learning theory, we have a lot of the major components there, right? We have individuals sitting down in front of a screen. We have them attending to behaviors. We see what's being modeled. We retain that information, and then we are hopefully not, but in this case, we are motivated to reenact or reproduce those behaviors. So I play Grand Theft Auto. I'm sitting there, I'm watching this guy steal someone's car, drive, find a woman, shoot her in the head. Okay. Social learning theory, if all things go according to the theory's plan, I have attended my cognitive resources, I paid attention to what happened, I retained the sequence of order, so I know, well, I could go out and steal a car and then, shoot a person. But the motivation is the key differentiator, right? I'm not motivated despite maybe the attention and retention of information. I'm not really motivated to go ahead and reproduce that behavior. Now, when people do reproduce that behavior, that's when we get into the dilemmas of, okay, is there an issue with the information that is being attended and retained by these individuals? And if so, how do we as a media source, as newsworthy sources, start to change our information that could theoretically make people want to reproduce really heinous behaviors? That's all for today. Talk to you soon.